But let's move to this story, which is still developing and, some might argue, becoming bigger by the hour. China has warned Keir Starmer of consequences if he doesn't approve its London embassy, accusing the UK of acting in bad faith. Beijing's threats come as MI5 raises fresh alarms over daily Chinese espionage, while relations sour amid the collapse in the spy case and accusations from both sides. And of course, we spoke just earlier this week with Sir Richard Lyall, former head of MI6, who said to us there was barely an hour would go past over there at MI6 HQ without a file landing on his desk marked China. Let's speak with Sir Lyall Grant, former National Security Advisor, former permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. Sir Mark, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
I mean, this is, I thought, I think my 11-year-old is aware of threats from China. I mean, I think he, sees enough stuff online and they learn stuff at school. He's at that age where a bit of geopolitics is entering his school syllabus, which is always good stuff. Why is anybody surprised that China might be a threat? I thought that was as factual as knowing that night follows day.
Well, I don't think anyone is surprised that China is a threat. It was a threat when I was National Security Advisor 10 years ago. And it's an even bigger threat today, as Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, spelt out again just yesterday. I think what people are surprised about, though, is how this case has collapsed. And I must say, I do think the Crown Prosecution Service has some serious questions to answer, because they presumably felt there was enough evidence to start the process at the beginning of 2024. The Court of Appeal then lowered the evidentiary threshold, and yet when it came down to it, they decided there wasn't enough evidence and blamed the government for not providing that evidence. But from what we've seen from the witness statements that have now been published, not to mention all the comments by heads of agencies at the time, etc., and indeed even the Foreign Secretary himself, David Lammy, then as was in this summer, making clear that China was a threat. So I think there is still some unanswered questions that will no doubt come out in these various parliamentary inquiries.
It all seems to rest, Mark, on this business of the government's declaration, previous government and this one, that, China was not really an enemy. They're not bad guys. Now, we can all see the sort of, to put it in layman's terms, the PR reasons why you might want that to be what's written on the tin marked, our relationship with China. But that seems to be where this case has collapsed.
Well, it does seem like that. That's what the CPS is saying. But one does wonder whether actually it's hiding a fact that they don't really have all that much solid evidence to convict both these individuals. But as I say, I think that'll come out in the inquiry. But Ian, if we just step back a moment, because when I was National Security Advisor, we discussed the strategic relationship with China on a number of occasions in the National Security Council. And bear in mind, this was originally the David Cameron, George Osborne sort of golden era of relations. But every discussion we had, you balance out three policy pillars: the security pillar, the prosperity economic pillar, and the values pillar. And every government of whatever stripe has to manage the relationship within those three pillars. Now, I think it's fair to say that when David Cameron was Prime Minister, the economic prosperity pillar was more prominent. Then Theresa May took over and chaired the council, and she came from a securocratic background, and security then sort of took predominance. The pendulum swung a little bit further in the security direction under Boris Johnson. It swung back a bit under Rishi Sunak, and it swung back further under this government. But every government has to grapple with the balance of the relationship with these three pillars: the economic benefits of dealing with China, the security risks of dealing with China, and the values fact that China doesn't really share any of our values, is not a democracy, and what it's doing in the South China Sea, etc. So the government is struggling with that, obviously. They do not want to say in a very formal document, China is an enemy. The last government didn't do that. No previous government has done that. And one can understand why they wouldn't want to do it. But that does not mean that they don't recognize it as a threat.
So in terms of it's a sort of a game that has to be played to a degree in order to obviously retain some kind of business relationship. You'd rather have somebody inside the tent than out. It's sort of a little bit of that going on. In terms of this case, where, you know, various sources, and as you will be more aware than I, Mark, in these kind of cases, everyone has a sort of an anecdote or a story, you know, in the annals of politics and associated divisions and areas, some suggesting that what is going on is sort of daily espionage of data being hoovered up from all manner of places within Parliament itself, in areas, MI5, MI6, areas such as that. I mean, there's not a place that is untouched by the sneaky hand of China. Is that a picture that you recognise, or is that a hyperbole?
Well, look, I absolutely recognize that China poses a cyber threat. We've seen a lot of cyber attacks against the government systems in particular, that they pose an espionage threat. I mean, traditionally, China was more interested in industrial secrets, intellectual property, etc., but they've now moved on to tackling sort of governmental secrets. So absolutely, they are active. Probably still not as active as the Russians, but nonetheless very active, and are becoming more proficient. So, of course, the intelligence agencies, particularly MI5, have to devote more resources to tackling that threat. Now, the interesting thing about this case, in a way, is it's at the very lower end of Chinese threats. I mean, yes, Parliament is one of our foundational institutions, but really what the information that was being gathered was essentially political gossip and tittle-tattle. You know, the much more serious secrets are out there.
Yeah.
And indeed, we heard rather bizarrely from Dominic Cummings this week that he thought that, you know, top secret information was regularly being intercepted and read by the Chinese. Well, that certainly comes as a surprise to me, but would be a much more serious breach of security than what these two individuals were accused of.
And as you rightly say, those kind of databases wouldn't be, I mean, you know, obviously our Houses of Parliament is a very important building, but it doesn't house that kind of data.
Quite so, quite so.
Where do you see this going? I mean, so is your contention here that there's a possibility that actually this case just wasn't a particularly strong case? I mean, is it as simple as that?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to speculate too much on that, Ian. I mean, the case against the one individual seems rather stronger than against the other, but we haven't seen all the evidence, so I don't want to sort of prejudge that. I think we'll learn more through these two parliamentary inquiries that are underway. But as you hinted at the beginning, what it has had is it makes it a lot more difficult for the government to take the decision about this new Chinese embassy in the heart of the City of London. And I understand that decision's now been put back again until December, no doubt because it's a very difficult time. And for the Chinese, that is a big issue. You know, they spent £200+ million acquiring this land in order to build an embassy, and they aren't going to be happy if the government decides they can't build an embassy there. And as you rightly said at the top, that, you know, they're beginning to threaten bilateral relations. Now, that's absolutely standard Chinese diplomatic tactics. It happened when I was involved in China relations. So one doesn't need to take that too seriously.
Sure.
But nonetheless, it's going to make that decision a lot more difficult.
And just a final question, as a former National Security Advisor, you know your way around this story better than most. Where do you mentioned Russia a moment ago. Is Russia still, is that the greatest threat? Is it a hybrid of Russia and China, or is it from somewhere else? In terms of data, which seems to be the kind of gold standard of stuff you can cause havoc with, where is it around the world? Where should we have our eye on?
Well, the big four, if you like, the axis of evil is once called, you know, if you're talking about Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, they're the ones who have very aggressive offensive cyber capabilities, and they're using it obviously against the UK and others on a regular basis. I would still, though, put Russia at the top, because Russia's not only doing sort of traditional espionage, if you like, but they are actually assassinating people on British streets. They're fomenting unrest in our country. They're trying to interfere in elections. They're undermining our institutions in a way that China actually is not at this stage. China does pose a longer term, more strategic threat than Russia, because it's a bigger country and it's a growing country, and Russia is a declining country. But nonetheless, in the short term, Russia still poses the biggest overall threat to British national security.
Interesting. Mark, lovely to have you on. Let's speak again. Really informed stuff from Sir Mark Lyall Grant. He is our former National Security Advisor, former permanent representative of the UK to the United Nations as well. Knows that territory better than almost anyone, apart from the bloke that does it now, I would imagine.